This is Living Catholic with Father Don Wolf. Living Catholic is a fresh look at issues confronting each of us today. This show deals with living Catholic, what that means for Catholics, as well as the impact on the rest of society. You certainly don't have to be Catholic to enjoy this show. And now your host, Father Don Wolf.
Welcome, Oklahoma, to Living Catholic. I'm Father Don Wolf, pastor of Sacred Heart Parish and rector of the Shrine of Blessed Stanley Rother. And why don't priests talk more about politics from the pulpit? That question floats around all the time, but especially this time of the year as we're approaching the height of the election season. Indeed, why don't priests talk more about politics and politicians as part of their responsibility in proclaiming the gospel? That is, in fact, a very good question to ask, because preachers are supposed to preach the gospel amid the circumstances of the day, making the gospel come alive. That's the responsibility of the one in the pulpit. It only stands to reason the people who are hearing the gospel need the Spirit's guidance when it comes to putting the word of the Lord into practice in their daily lives. Certainly, hearing a suggestion that would inform the people in the parish would be a welcome enlightenment amid the darkness of the world. Having the pastor inform the people in these circumstances would be a service to all who strove to understand their place in the Lord's kingdom, wouldn't it? And it certainly is the case that in repressive countries, the governments have striven to keep the clergy from talking about political issues from the pulpit. In Nazi Germany, for example, priests were allowed to talk about almost anything, as long as their words never touched on government policy. Making recommendations about prayer and fasting, or talking to people, or taking people to task concerning sexual morality and chaste comportment, guiding parishioners about study and social involvement. All of these things were fine as long as they didn't touch on matters the government cared about. Do that, and you could find yourself in big trouble. Other governments put similar restraints in place as they sought to keep their power. They didn't want pastors talking about much. So if these governments didn't want their priests talking, shouldn't priests in a free society talk loudly? Isn't the implied job of the preacher to help inform the parishioners about what they should do and how they should act? And isn't this even more the case when the issues are intricate and complicated and most everyone needs help in sorting them out? Making recommendations about how to think about issues and how to vote would be a real service to just about everyone, wouldn't it? Certainly, if the repressive regimes were afraid of what might be said from the pulpit, shouldn't the people of a free country be hearing such counsel from their priests? It only stands to reason they should. Now, a good number of not-so-repressive governments have tried to enlist the Church's voice to reinforce their politics. All manner of initiatives were taken, for example, during the change of religious practice in England, to instruct pastors all over the realm to preach in support of the king and the king's ministers concerning their conduct of religious matters. And that was more than a nudge. The Crown actually wrote the sermons the pastors were instructed to read to their people. In the mind of the royalty, preachers were the mouthpiece of the realm, and they brooked no opposition from them. In fact, their presumption was that the role of ministers and priests was to keep the people on the side of the king in every matter. In modern terms, the churches were to be the government's publication arm. And by the way, it was a law that people were required to go to church. Staying home was not allowed. So for the guys in ermine robes and gold chains, it was all very cozy. Throughout most of the church's history, this has been the case. The clergy have been recruited to make sure the people think the right thoughts and do the right things, which would be that which the governing authority wanted them to do. We don't much think about it now, but one of the products of the royal support of the church was that the church did, in fact, speak the king's message to its people. Of course, in those places, the king was a believer who also wanted to go to heaven and wanted his kingdom to be a Catholic Christian one. So his message was also a genuine concern for his people's salvation. And in this arrangement, for most of its history, the people had no voice in the decisions and initiatives of their government. So it was immaterial what they thought about any particular issue. As a matter of practicality, it was more important for them to know what the king thought than it was for the king to know what they thought. So telling them of the king's actions and of the king's piety was much more important than any other message. And thus it was done. This may sound as if the gospel had been abandoned in the process, but it's more complicated than that. Living the gospel always takes place in the interstices of the world events. And in the time of kings and princes, the governing process was put in place by the decisions of those who were born into aristocracy. Everyone else lived his or her life concerned with the issues of charity and morality and behavior, not with the direction of the court or the future of the nation. Thus it was that the message of the pulpit concerned those personal concerns rather than informing people about the grave issues of statehood. What people expected and what they received were instructions concerning their responsibilities to the practice of the faith and their conduct with one another. Different ages, of course, prompted different concerns. In the 4th century in Alexandria, the place that Evelyn Waugh described as, quote, the ancient asparagus bed of theological absurdities, unquote, the crowds went rampaging through the streets in various large mobs, clashing with cudgels and knives based on what their pastors had told them about the prospect of belief in the Trinity. One gang shouted their motto that the Spirit proceeded solely from the Father, while rival gangs shouted that the procession of the Spirit was definitely from the Father and the Son. They took turns assaulting one another, often leaving more than a few people dead in the streets, based on the enlivening words from their respective pulpits. In colonial America, the Pilgrims and their descendants, who were described by later historians as drunk on words, they preached hours-long sermons detailing whether it was appropriate for believers to raise their hands in prayer while praying alone, or whether such gestures and rituals were to be left behind as the corrupt detritus of the Catholicism they had abandoned. Instructions from the pulpit were crafted so as to make life better for everyone, which meant that the whole community, including its governance, were to share a common understanding and a common practice. And such things from the pulpit were considered necessary. In fact, they were thought to be vital. Things began to change a bit in the 19th century when popular opinion became a reality in the dynamics of governance. It was the case that what people thought and how they acted really mattered to those in charge. With systems of government that included the affirmations of the whole population, it became important for the government to begin to convince their people of what was good for them and what was necessary. This preoccupation became a reality even in states none of us would consider open or democratic. Even in the 19th century, places like Germany and Russia, the leaders who were under very little constraint from the average person or from democratic influence, they felt they had to do something to convince their people of their intentions and actions. This reached the most iconic expression when the Kaiser in Germany at the beginning of the 20th century instructed the churches there that the clergy were to preach sermons detailing Alfred Thayer Mahan's theories of strategic sea power, thus justifying the building of the German Navy. Can you imagine hearing of the miracle of Jesus walking on the water from the Gospel of Mark, only to be seated so as to hear of the constraints of maritime choke points to determine the outline of national trade? But such are the realities of the pulpit. Everywhere and at all times, there have been demands on what ought to be said from the pulpit. We have different sets of demands and our own unique preoccupations when it comes to the issues facing us in our day. But in every age, the challenge of preaching includes trying to figure out what it is that people are to hear and how they are to act on what they hear. Keeping to the gospel, focusing on Jesus, and living a life in Christ. Those are not easy to make clear to everyone. Or it should be said, it's not a simple task to preach these concerns in complicated environments. Thus, the cry intensifies for preachers who will animate their parishioners with the right things from the pulpit. After all, Jesus transformed the entire world by what he said. To transform and to motivate would be to do what Jesus did. And the apostles, they were able to move their society to a whole new understanding of itself. In the Acts of the Apostles, it described Peter's sermon on the day of Pentecost that had 3,000 people turn their hearts and their lives to the promise of God poured out in Christ. Certainly, modern preaching ought to be able to accomplish this, even if its results were somewhat more meager. Even if preachers didn't have to demand such florid results, they could always pour out their responsibilities in ways that could set the stage for the future. After all, Peter and Paul didn't condemn slavery or decry the treatment of women. But 500 years after them, the church they helped to found and the society they helped to promote had effectively abolished bondage and had ennobled women. Brave preaching could set the stage for a world renewed in the virtues of God's goodness poured out in His church. Good preaching could set the foundation for a world remade. That's what everyone in the church really wants. Of course, it's hard to know exactly what it would look like, although there are contrasts that we could imagine. The easiest scenario is that of the brave pastor who ascends the pulpit and begins his exposition to all the people in the parish concerning the right and just things they should believe and say. The righteous preacher can cut through the obfuscation and misleading swill swirling among all the topics of the day so that good people could get busy doing the right thing and lead their lives in conformity to the gospel and to the church. While he's talking, he might raise the hackles of those who oppose the good or disagree with the words of Christ. But this intrepid man of God can stand in the breach to make sure his words are heard and his truths are accepted. In his fearlessness, he is the very incarnation of St. John the Baptist or St. Stephen. People might rush at him figuratively with their hands over their ears to keep from hearing what he has to say, but by way of him, the truth will out. What could be more brave and more holy than that? Shouldn't the church expect that? Of course, that's what Father Coughlin used to do. He was the most famous Catholic media star of the 1930s. How famous? He had double the radio audience of Rush Limbaugh in a population that was 1/2 the size. And his message was to criticize the Roosevelt administration's New Deal, to criticize the Jews, whom he said ran the world, business, and everything else, and call for people to vote in a new administration. Now, what could be more brave than that? Of course, there's also the opposite picture. There's the deluded clergyman who comes to the pulpit with a message of confusion and uncertainty. He's so caught up in the current of his times, he doesn't realize his words are the warmed-over thoughts of every celebrated second-rate thinker of the last generation. He goes on, thinking he's breaking new ground, all the while he's plowing the same furrow as yesterday and the month before. In fact, every time he approaches his familiar topics, he's so out of touch he doesn't realize he's merely saying the same thing over and over. He does a responsible job in that he prepares what he will say, but his analysis is misplaced, so he's solving problems no one has and answering questions no one asks. And he's describing a course of behavior and decision-making that will do nothing for anyone. And all of this is delivered with thundering confidence that the world will be better off no matter the fact that everything has been tried before, both disastrously and bitterly. I'm thinking of the editors of America magazine. They proposed in their 2016 election edition that all Catholics should vote for Hillary Clinton, since abortion was untouchable and would never change, and every child who made it through the rather fine sieve of survival would be better off in her administration. It was inconceivable in their minds that there could be a case made for the opposite. In fact, they thought it sinful to imagine such a thing. As you might guess, which is which depends very much on your point of view with regard to what is said. I've heard both. I've lived with clergymen who have done both. I've been both. It's not easy to know what to say and how to say it in the way that can be heard. Every preacher wants to be brave and timely, able to move minds and open hearts to the presence of Christ and the meaning of the gospel. But not all of us know exactly what this will do. Nor are we clear about what will accomplish this in our day and time. Not only that, to go to the next layer of complication, not all of us know what particular law or point of advocacy or political event will accomplish any of the elements of our preaching. Most of the time, we preachers are not sure. Being the brave prophet, telling the people in the pews with hungry hearts where to find satisfaction, isn't easy. Not to mention the fact that priests are not especially or particularly good at politics. William F. Buckley said one time he'd rather be governed by the first 100 people named in the New Haven phone book than by the faculty at Harvard. He was making the point that expertise and access are not the same as wisdom and experience and are no substitute for careful deliberation and stewardship. By analogy, I don't presume preachers are uniquely qualified to lay out what their parishioners should do in the voting booth. A priest of my acquaintance didn't share this conviction. He was confident in his abilities to read the politics of the day and was convinced it was his job to share his insights with his parishioners, which he did weekly. Most of them had settled into his point of view, and they either enjoyed his opinion because it reinforced their own, or they simply endured, knowing that they were to get a load of argumentation contrary to what they thought. Thankfully, they accepted him for who he was and could value him for all of his good points and chose not to focus on their disagreements. However, one day, this priest decided to harp on the defunding of a federal program in that current administration's budget. He spoke about it for a time, and with that, he concluded his sermon. Later that week, he got a letter from somebody who had been a visitor at Mass who disagreed with him. The visitor explained that in his preaching, he didn't understand the report that he referred to about that particular federal program, that the defunding he was talking about had not taken place, that his indignation about it was not only misplaced, but was grossly ignorant of the facts. The letter concluded that if he, the preacher, knew so little about what he was talking about, perhaps he shouldn't talk about it. And this same priest, who told this story on himself, wondered what kind of nut would take so much time to complain about such a little thing that got said in the pulpit. As the priest said, can you believe anybody would take those things so seriously? Apparently, those things are taken seriously. Politics and pulpits make for a tough mixture. That may be why the energy around them swirls in such strong currents. So preachers often stay away from the specifics of politics in the pulpits, and when they stray into the pastures of policies and personalities that are the political decisions of the times, they most often turn into minefields. It may be somewhat different for those parishes and churches in which the congregations are formed around the personality of the pastor more than anything else. People can define themselves according to how much they agree with what they hear from the pulpit and are proud to know the slant and advocacy of the preacher. But I don't think most parishes are like that. Don't get me wrong, priests and pastors like to be liked and they want to be well thought of. In fact, we all want to be regarded as innovative and prophetic. At the same time, we know the swirling takes of political life are everywhere and different. Talking about a specific politician or a specific policy can be treacherous. Added to this are the limitations of political reality. Were a priest to go to the pulpit to endorse, say, John Kennedy in 1960 and invite people to consider his faith life and therefore vote for him because he was a Catholic, was the priest endorsing the Democratic Party's view on tax rates and foreign policy or mutually assured nuclear destruction? Or was the priest just trying to get a Catholic into office? And how brave and prophetic are his words when the Catholic president's actions are later revealed to have been less than universally blessed? Should the priest have pointed to the candidate's positions, to his personality, to his policies, or to his persuasion? Or could a good priest have endorsed Nixon with all of his foibles and compromises? Which would have been the responsible thing to have done? In the midst of the advocacy of one or the other, and with the benefit of hindsight, who were actually the best choice with regard to the country as a whole and to the proclamation of the gospel in its entirety? As Father Richard John Newhouse used to write, the one who marries himself to the spirit of the age becomes a widower in the next election. Kennedy did spark the imagination of an entire generation. He seemed to have the right view when it came to the Cuban Missile Crisis, although we now know his youthfulness and vision were products of media manipulation and lying as much as the true spirit of the age, unless we acknowledge that such manipulations are, in fact, the spirit of every age. And the Cuban Missile Crisis had also been prompted by the administration's mistakes as much as by Russian intent. Would Nixon have been the wrong choice for Catholics? What should have been the recommendation for the careful Catholic? But most of this was unknown or unknowable at the time, and at the election, the faithful Catholic had to pull the lever for somebody. The choice had to be made by everyone who voted, and it had to be made concerning real human beings, not angels and saints. But should it have been prompted by pastors? That's the question. And whatever passion the preacher brought to the pulpit for whichever candidate at that moment looks quaint and mistaken now. Whether it was policy, prospects, or personality, the facts we know at this moment seem to diminish whatever recommendations may have been made. What was the will of God in the election in 1960? How were the pastors of the day to interpret and advocate for it? Those questions are near impossible to answer. Imagine justifying the choice before the face of God on Judgment Day. And let's not forget the specter of manipulation, both overt and covert, by those who knew what they were doing to mislead and lie about what was real and actual. In the end, we try to talk about what we know, we preachers, and what's important. All of us are limited by our ignorance and our times. We only know what we know. When it comes to the ins and outs of politics, we're often not able to make firm recommendations. It's not because we're cowards. It's because we know enough to know we don't know all we could or should know. I have my own political opinions, and I think they're right, which is why I have them. But I also know they're mine. I respect those who have different opinions, even when I know them to be mistaken and ill-informed. Given the right opportunities, I'd like to be sure they know what's true and what's false. Often so many political issues don't even rise to the low bar of true facts. But these opportunities don't always present themselves. So in the pulpit, we do our best to talk about justice and injustice, to strive to present the energies motivating our behavior, and we try to name evil in its true form, not just the darkness tinging the pictures of today. The greatest antidote, after all, to the anxieties of the present is a more thorough knowledge of the past. Every concern I've heard expressed about the confusions of today are conditioned by the difficulties of yesterday. The debates going on in Washington or at the state capitol are versions of issues that have been dealt with over and over. In the end, we have to strive to seek God in our lives and to make decisions based on the contours of what we know and how we are to act. If you'd like some insight about the lies people tell, the manipulation they like, or what people delight in being told even when it's not true, I'm happy to let you know. I just don't think it's very effective to do it directly from the pulpit. Back in just a moment. Welcome back to our final segment, Faith in Verse. We have a poem today called At the Pulpit. He steps to the pulpit on his Sunday morning, carrying the squalling child of his charge. First, second readings, meanings of warning. Jesus' journey and message next, looming large. And all eyes turn to him as each person settles in to wait, preparing to listen to God's own voice speaking. Across the years now past, all growing late, as each heart his grace is hungry for, seeking. He wonders, beginning, how his faint words could in some way repeat what God has done. He might as well imitate the flight of birds, abandon his pulpit and flap his arms to the sun. He will, haltingly in low voice, begin, searching ever then for the courage needed to fill this time to which he must attend, nourish the base shoots sprouted from what was seeded. Will fail, will say less than could be said, will be as mute to many waiting souls. For many, his words will be as moldy bread. Others will receive as soup, watery and cold. But this Sunday he shall incessantly attempt to speak the word yet spoken, in lesser words, his own in measure scantily, even if they be but his, a try, a token. For from his pulpit, week following upon week, his message tumbles forth from his stolid lips, so that any who are willing to listen, to seek, might find, even if his words dribble and slip. That's At the Pulpit. I hope to join us in the weeks to come here at Living Catholic.
Living Catholic is a production of Oklahoma Catholic Radio. To learn more, visit okcr.org.